Good morning. Uh, Thank you for being here. Welcome to Aristo English Exam Analysis for the HKDSE 2020. My name is Yancy, and I am an English editor of Aristo. Today, I have Mr. Glenn Thomas here, who's also our speaker. And together, we'll be presenting to you what we have noticed and seen on this year's English exam. And we will also be briefly talking a little bit about what our newest teaching and learning materials for to help you and your students prepare for future exams will be. So before we begin, there are two links that we have shared in the chat box. The first one is a handout of the exam information that we have put together. It's a PDF file. You can easily just click on the link and download that. And most of the information that we're presenting on the PowerPoint slide that you will see shortly is actually on that handout. The second link is an information letter to invite you if you want to learn more about our publications and also other support material for teaching and learning. You are welcome to set up another meeting with us. We can give you more details. We can walk you through our products for that. And so those are the two links that you can find on the chat box. If you have any questions or any difficulty, please feel free to let us know. And without further ado, we are not going to have our faces on today. We're mostly going to focus on letting you see everything we have prepared on the PowerPoint slide, and you'll hear our voices. So let's see. Share. So, okay. So let's begin. So today we're going to take a look at the latest HKDSE exam. We will again be talking a little bit about the trends that we have seen in the last few years, similarities and differences in terms of content, structure, question types, and formats. We'll be highlighting some specific elements on the exam that students of various levels of English language skills might find challenging. Very naturally, we're going to start with paper 1 reading, then we'll move on to paper 2 writing. Then Mr. Glenn Thomas will talk to us about paper 3 listening integrated skills, and also paper 4 speaking, which is actually last year's paper 4. Obviously, this year we didn't have one. So let's begin by taking a look at paper 1 reading. So on the screen here, you will see a table listing out the different topics featured in this year's paper 1 reading text. You also see the other ones from 2016 on. If you want more information from 2012, you can actually see all of those topics listed out in our handout. What I'd like to point out today, if you look at the table from 2016 to 2018, the topics in parts B1 and B2 actually belong to the same major theme. But since last year and this year, we actually see that parts B1 and part B2 actually feature different themes and topics. So that's one difference that we have seen. We don't know what's going to happen next year, but this is what we've seen in these 5 years. And also, as usual, we took a look at how easily students can relate to these topics and maybe how familiar they are with each of these topics. So what's interesting this year is that we find in part A and part B2, something we think students will probably have at least some exposure to. In part A, you have a theme and topic revolving around building conservations, heritage. These are actually hot topics that are regularly featured on the news. In part B2, the concept of agony aunt, giving someone advice that they need or someone seeking advice. This is not something too unfamiliar for students. They have been exposed to it. So it's interesting that we find this year part A and part B2 aren't too tricky in terms of the topic selection. Whereas in part B1, kite flying, this is a very interesting one. We tend to think that the topic is probably not completely foreign to students, but this generation of millennials probably did not grow up with too much kite flying. So this is probably a topic that the older generation has memories of, but something that students in this era might not be very familiar with. We'll dive more into that in terms of like language use and vocabulary shortly. So let's take a look at text 1 in part A. So this text is taken from a magazine called Zolima's City Mag. It is an online culture magazine that covers topics on art, history, culture, design, etc. The article was published in 2018, and this text centers around Tai Kun, which, as you know, is a center of art and heritage that was the result of a restoration project of the former Victoria Prison and Central Police Station compound. There are a few specific discussion points in this text. So they talk about the typical issues and controversies when an older building goes through conservation and restoration. Talking about the decisions on how much of the original building is to be preserved and what new elements are acceptable or appropriate to be added. There are details in terms of architecture. What was the original design and what was the final design? There are some heavy descriptions of the structures. Then there are also parts that talk about the rationales behind different designs and points of contentions that accumulating in discussion of the historical cultural values of the whole compound and its neighborhood, as well as what were the designers' hopes or the current management's hopes and wishes for what the compound can do for the neighborhood in the modern day. So that is part A, which is quite complex, and there are many layers to this text. Let's move on to part B1. Part B1 has two texts. Text 2, which is the first text in part B1, gives a general guideline on kite flying. The source is very interesting. On the exam paper, it actually states National Kite Month. If you look it up on Google, you can actually find a PDF document on American Kite Flyers Association that is basically where this text is taken from. It talks about how to fly a kite, and the formatting of that PDF document actually looks like a pamphlet. Now, the actual National Kite Month is an actual event that is organized by the American Kite Flyers Association. But the link that is featured on it isn't the actual link. In the text itself, there are clear sections with subheadings on some fundamentals of kite flying. For example, what kind of wind is good for kite flying, where to fly, what dangers to look out for, how best to enjoy kite flying. The concept and the language of this text is very easy. Kite flying, however, as an activity for students these days, as we can expect, could be quite foreign of a concept. What is interesting, I do want to point out, is that 4 out of 20 points on this text actually test students' understanding of website layout and function. So it's actually testing their understanding of what web information is. How do they find relevant information? Now let's look at the second text in our part B1. It's on the same topic on kite flying. This text gives a more in-depth look at the changes and the development of kite flying in Hong Kong. It is taken from Varsity. It is a magazine written, edited, and designed by journalism students at CUHK. The article was actually dated 2014. It has a very clear structure of a feature article. It starts with an intriguing anecdote which is on a father-daughter relationship, what the father expects his daughter when they go on this activity of kite flying. It talks about the glorious past of kite flying in Hong Kong. The actual point of contention is the decline of kite flying, the reasons for that, specific details. In the conclusion, it has a pretty gloomy outlook of the future of kite flying in Hong Kong. Now, this is the topic of kite flying, again, we believe is quite foreign to students, but students are probably familiar with narratives that talk about something of the past that they mostly no longer share, or they don't partake in so much in these days. And lastly, part B2. It is actually a combination of two separate articles from the Telegraph. The first half, the first part is Graham Norton talking about his experiences, and then there are two letters. The part where Norton talks about his experiences and the second letter, they are actually from the same article in 2011, whereas another letter that is featured in this text was taken from a much more recent Telegraph article in 2017. So it is a combination of two separate articles. The background of this text is Graham Norton's advice column in the Telegraph. He wrote it for 12 years and stepped down at the end of 2018. Graham Norton himself, we might not be so familiar with. He's a TV radio presenter, comedian, actor, etc. He's a public personality. The first part of the text, like I mentioned earlier, has many pieces of self-reflections by Norton on his role as an agony uncle. It naturally flows into the final message, which is to be positive. But the ideas that are presented do not really follow a particular order in the first half of this text. Letter 1 is a teenager writing to Norton to ask for advice on studying abroad, career choices, and making decisions for life. The second letter is a very interesting short letter about hair cutting, someone asking for advice on hair cutting. So students are probably not familiar with Norton, but they should be quite familiar with the concept of agony aunt, since a lot of teaching and learning materials in Hong Kong actually talk about the concept of agony aunt, seeking advice, giving advice. So they should be quite relatable for students. Now let's take a look at the text types of this year's paper 1. The text type variety isn't too surprising. What I would like to point out is that this is the 4th year in a row where we see web information included as a text for part B1. It continues to feature chunks and information in shorter passages, usually with subheadings. Part B2 is somewhat autobiographical, and it might remind you of 2014's Part B2, which is on Stephen Fry, and also the autobiography excerpt from Clive James last year. So what we want to point out is that probably students who are aiming at taking Part B2 should and need to develop reading skills beyond practical usage of being able to understand newspaper articles or magazine articles. They really need to read a huge variety of text types, including narratives with a stronger first-person voice that may at times sound like rambling. They need to be able to unravel the information that is presented. And also, they need to understand metaphors and idiomatic expressions which are heavily featured in these texts. Now, a very quick look at the number of texts and the length of the reading text. So here you can see a table comparing the word counts of each year's paper. Again, this information is already on the handout, and you can find the handout in the link that we have sent you in the chat box. Part A this year is the longest that we have seen yet. It's getting close to 1,100 words. Part B1 is a similar length to last year's. It's 3 years in a row now where Part B1's text total up to just over 1,000 words. Part B2 is the longest yet. It is over 1,200 words. It is very much in line with the trend that we've been seeing in terms of what kind of length students attempting Part B2 are expected to be able to handle. So let's take a look at the language used, the vocabulary, words, and phrases that are featured in these texts. Part A, we can see quite a few difficult words, especially since this is the compulsory part where everybody has to attempt. What we have highlighted in yellow, those words and phrases are actually ones that are featured in the questions specifically. So students really need to be able to understand what they mean in order to answer some of the questions. Here's part B1. Text 2 is definitely on the easier side of things. There are some technical terms like windsock and some more complex language in terms of a longer phrase such as fellowship to be found at the end of a kite line. So there are some word plays, for example, on at the end of the line. Therefore, now they say at the end of a kite line as part of the text. In terms of text 3, there's not so it's not lacking in language use that may be unfamiliar to students. For example, the word grounding that we have highlighted here, it's in the title, and students actually need to understand the meaning of that word because it's actually featured directly in a question. Part B2. The individual words, like each word this year compared to just last year's or some other years where Part B2 is a little bit more dense and more difficult, this year doesn't seem necessarily that difficult. However, what we find is that this text is packed with a lot of metaphors that students and also words that students need to understand their cultural context. So, for example, the author used medicine as a metaphor throughout the first part of the text. And so you can see phrases such as the Hippocratic Oath or a longer phrase such as rummage around in my medical bag. These can be quite challenging to some students. There are also phrases that require cultural understanding. So, for example, they mentioned the best man speech. That is not a common feature in weddings in Hong Kong. So students will actually need to have some cultural background in what a best man is and what a best man speech is. And also the use of aspirin, for example, for headaches, is probably not necessarily part of a normal teenager's worldly knowledge. Or the lingonberry jam, being known as a Swedish delicacy, is probably more of a kind of knowledge that your typical adults would have, but not so much a teenager. Now let's take a look at the question types and formats. So there are 3 types of questions that I'd like to highlight specifically on this year's paper 1. So there's matching, summary and close, and also questions requiring extended responses, such as paraphrasing and also summarizing. So first off, let's take a look at the formats and shapes of the matching questions this year. We see a huge variety this year in terms of matching questions. In parts A and B1, there are questions requiring students to match names to speech acts. So there are some texts that feature many names. So we do think that students may want to circle the names in the text while skimming through them, just because there are so many of them, and under the pressure of the exam, it can be quite stressful to have to find them again. It's a very simple technique that will help them with their performance. In part B2, there are more than one matching question. So shown here that we see, we haven't shown all of them. This one we want to highlight. Question 60 asks students to match categories that are mentioned by Graham Norton in part 1, in the first part of the text, to specific stories and anecdotes that are mentioned in the text. This one we really find extremely challenging because the answers are really not spelled out at all. So this is one very challenging matching question that actually features 7 points. A second type of questions, summary close. We see them every year. This year, we see more or less of a classic short passage format. And also, we see something that looks like a chart. The summary close questions in parts A and B1 require students to take words and phrases directly from the reading passage. This is something we have seen last year. It can be easier. It might not necessarily be easier because there are extra limitations. Part B2 is what we want to highlight. Part B2 has a very special requirement. Students can only write a maximum of 4 words in each blank or in each part of the answer. So that can be quite challenging. This one, we don't believe they can take the answers directly out from the passage. Last type of questions requiring extended response, and we have been seeing this as a trend for the last few years. Students really need to know how to paraphrase and summarize in their own words in order to answer a question. So, and we find that this year's especially, we cannot expect students to be able to directly copy the answers from the text. So they really must be able to first grasp the main ideas and then put it in their own words. These I'd like to mention, as you can see here, these types of questions are actually featured in all 3 parts of the exam. So part A has it, part B1 has it as well. That is challenging. Part B2, of course, has them. So in part A, 3 out of 42 points. Part B1, 3 out of 42 points, and part B2, 6 marks in total. So it's actually very important for students to learn to improve their performance in these questions by drilling those skills. And we also want to mention that it seems that in the reading paper alone, students cannot just have reading skills. They really need to also hone in their writing skills for this paper. And we do see that happening as well in paper 2, which we'll move on to right now. We're seeing that students actually need to also be able to use their reading skills, or even maybe paper 3 integrated skills in paper 2. Let's take a look at that. So here is a table that talks about the part A of paper 2 exam, the text types, assigned identities, and structures. So this year, in terms of content, this and the setting of the question, we think they're quite accessible to students. They can basically write as themselves. You can assume that they have been to a restaurant and they have been restaurant customers. What they need to do is to write a food review. So these days we can safely assume that students have some kind of exposure to what food reviews look like. They have been taught it, and you can assume that they will probably have read some food reviews in their daily lives when they pick restaurants. So we don't think part A is too difficult or tricky this year. Let's take a look at part B. A quick note, this year, the order of the electives have once again been scrambled up a little bit. that has happened for many years now, so we really cannot expect the electives to be featured in a specific order. What we see across all these 8 questions is that they require very specific content. There aren't really generic questions. Students are required to write with very, very specific content points. And this is where we think students need to read very carefully, underline, circle all of the question requirements for each question in order to be able to actually fulfill them in their writing. So let's talk about some of the tricky parts, right? So in question 2, students need to be aware of the fact that they're supposed to have done interviewing before they do the writing. It's part of their research as part of their identity in writing this piece. So they need to mention some interviewing, probably make some direct quotes, and talk about that research preparation in their essay. In question 5, there are 3 criteria that students must mention and explain how Dragon Boat Racing fulfills them. That is a very specific requirement. In question 8, the writing is the first chapter. It's very, very interesting. Usually we see short stories required of students. And we have spent years, teachers have spent years teaching students that you must write a good ending for the stories. Now this year, it specifically requires students to write the first chapter of the story. And as we all know, first chapters do not have real endings. They have cliffhangers. So but I will not say much more until I see the report on this. But I do think this is a little bit of a deviation from your usual short story, and that is a very specific technical point that students might need to pay attention to. Other stuff that I'd like to highlight. Question 6, for example, it asks very specifically for students to comment on the effectiveness of food labels. And as we have seen on the reports from the past few years, it's very easy for students to fall into the traps of just giving their opinions on something like this. So say they can easily fall into the trap of just commenting on whether or not they think the labels are correct, instead of commenting specifically on the effectiveness, which is what the question is asking of them. Question 8 and question 9, there are some very specific information that they need to pay attention to. Question 8 is actually part of a competition held by a sci-fi magazine. That is not necessarily spelled out in the rest of the description, so students might not understand. They might be missing out on the part that it needs to have some sci-fi element in the story. And question 9, it has a very specific location, the Xichu Center. If students have never been there, it's probably quite difficult for them to answer this question, especially if they have never seen Chinese opera. And even if they have, the likelihood that some students are very good at, that most students would be very good at describing Chinese opera in English is probably not very probable. Let's put it that way. So, yep, that's the overview of Part B of writing. Let's take a look at the text type distribution of this year's paper 2. So, news report was an addition from last year, and it has also appeared this year. Question 5 is specifically a letter format, but the purpose of writing is to propose something. So you will see here that we have put a bracketed one under proposal because we believe the language, the tone, the register, simply the way it's written, even though it's a letter, it needs to probably reflect some proposal elements in it. What I also want to point out is this year's paper 2 is the first time where we see this text type being specified as an argumentative essay. We have seen essays before, but not specifically argumentative essays. So that's worth pointing out. And lastly, about paper 2, I'd like to point out that this year's question format is similar to last year. So you will see there's always a picture that goes with each part B question. Now, whether or not all of the pictures are very useful, very relevant prompts for each question, that's up to debate, and let's see the report later. I do want to mention there are very specific, I've mentioned earlier that there are very specific background content points that students need to pay attention to as they attempt each question. What is similar but a little different this year is that instead of 3 bullet points, we see 2 bullet points. The first one, again, like last year, points out what text type students need to write. And the second one will actually specify what contents must be included in each one of them. So maybe we'll see this question format again next year. Maybe we'll not, but we definitely see a trend of more specific content required of students in paper 2. And now we're going to move on to paper 3, and Mr. Glenn Thomas will be taking you through that.
Thank you, Yancy. After papers 1 and 2 comes paper 3, listening and integrated skills. And as we all know, this paper tests candidates' listening skills, as well as their ability to process information from recordings and written data to complete practical tasks under various situations. Let's take a quick overview of the themes and situations that have appeared in the last papers. In part A, each theme of the year allows very specific tasks to be accomplished under practical situations, which are mostly either a workplace or school context. Although a family situation appeared in 2016 and the context was non-specified in 2017. For this year's paper 3, the theme centers around exploration, but there isn't a definite specific context for the whole part. It's unclear whether the situation is school or workplace based, and the candidate hears the conversations between the speakers in a third-person point of view, and no specific role is assigned to the listener of these conversations. As for the recordings, the first 3 tasks are conversations between various speakers. In task 1, Julia and Mark discuss an eco-expedition package they found on a web page. The two go through the package details, such as the destination and length of the expedition. They talk about the main activity of the expedition and the accommodation. They also read a map and talk about the locations of several campsites. Last but not least, they discuss reviews written by previous participants. So in other words, there's quite a lot to do here. However, task 1 is almost certainly the easiest one of the 4 tasks. Candidates are required to write down key information and to label a map, and the questions are quite straightforward with nice lead-ins apart from 1 or 2 tricky items. Task 2 is an interview with Anita Carter, a researcher for a documentary about exploring an oceanic trench. The interview starts with a short introduction to the research background, then moves on to a discussion about 3 deep-sea creatures found in the trench. The researcher focuses on snailfish and explains the functions of some of its body parts and why it's difficult to bring it to the water surface for research. Julia and Mark in task 1 appear in task 3 again. In this task, they visit an exhibition at a history museum and a doomed exhibition to discuss the journey with a museum guide. The guide introduces some technological features of the expedition ship and how the crew supported and entertained themselves at that time. The guide goes on to explain why the expedition was a failure and how the remains of the ship were discovered in recent years. Interestingly, this was almost identical to an old HKDSE past paper in, I believe, the late 1980s. Almost the same topic was discussed, but some of the details were altered. So it'd be quite interesting if you want to look at the old 80s HKCE multiple choice papers, almost the exact passage came up. The 4th and final task of part A is an extract from an audiobook and a historian's criticism of it. In the extract, the author of the book takes readers through his journey finding a temple and a statue and explains why he had to take away historical items in this research. It's all very Indiana Jones. After the audiobook extract is played, a historian shares her opinions and explains why she disapproves of some parts of the book and the author's claims. So here we have a breakdown of what each task involves and the skills required to complete it. Task 1 requires various mini tasks in a note sheet that contains some points, tables, and a map. The information is mostly facts about an eco-expedition package found on a web page. And candidates mainly only need to listen for specific information about the package to get the answers accurately. Although the tasks and the variety of sub-skills may seem overwhelming at first glance, the skills are actually quite basic. There is a multiple choice selection question in task 1, and it is in the format shown on the screen. Based on what the two speakers say in the recording, candidates are required to determine the accommodation facilities available. And one thing worth noting is that the number of ticks that should be put on the table is clearly indicated by the instructions, tick 3. And the question numbers 8 to 10 also tell you there's 1 mark for each option. So altogether, there are 3 marks here, which is quite a high percentage. And a useful skill here, I believe, is prediction, because when it gave the options, it mentions hot and cold showers as options. And using your common sense, you're pretty sure that they've got these 2 options there for a reason, that one of them is definitely going to be chosen. And with it being looking at wildlife and in the wild, you can also sort of guess it's very likely to be cold water. Even if you get the wrong answer, by trying to guess it, it'll actually help you with your listening skills and focusing on the question. For the map labeling questions in task 1, candidates are required to listen for compass points and directions. They also need to pay close attention to the graphic descriptions of the campsite, like those shown on the screen. Now, I found this very interesting and also quite easy, because there are actually 2 sets of clues given for most of the options, both visual and directional. For example, in the north, we have insects to observe. So it tells you, if we look at the northern part of the map, so you already know that you're looking at the northern part and there's only 1 option there already. And then it'll say, you'll notice there are insects. And then you'll see the diagram of the insects, which makes it a double clue, making it very, very easy to get the answer. The only slightly tricky item was where 2 spots on the map were quite close together. So there you really had to discriminate between the 2 types of animals shown in the 2 pictures. Otherwise, I thought it was a very straightforward and a nice little exercise. Okay, towards the end of task 1, the 2 speakers read and discuss some reviews on the Eco Expedition package. Candidates are required to identify whether a review is positive or negative. And then they need to extract one of the comments made in the reviews to complete the review statement. For example, it might say the negative review thought that the, and then blank. And you've got to fill in the missing words. For example, thought that the food was awful, or something like this. This was one of the most challenging parts of a relatively easy section, I thought. And the other that I liked was a classic old type of question where they change from US dollars to Hong Kong dollars. So they say something costs 700 US dollars, and then you have to convert it to Hong Kong dollars. And most people will be writing the US dollars before they realize they need to convert it to Hong Kong dollars. An old technique that's come back into play. Moving on to task 2. In this task, a scientist known as Dr. Carter is interviewed for a documentary about ocean exploration. Students have to complete a note sheet. And one notable feature in part A this year is that there are more multiple choice questions. In task 2 alone, there are 5 questions choosing options or with multiple choice elements. 3 of them require candidates to blacken the circle for the correct answer, like the one shown on the screen. The first multiple choice question in task 2 requires candidates to determine the reason Dr. Carter's research team decided to explore a certain trench. We think the question is a little bit tricky because not only is the answer having to be factually correct, it also has to correctly explain the action. In this question, one of the options is factually correct, but doesn't correctly explain why they decided to explore the area. So students really have to focus on what is written down as well as the actual listening text. So it's a combination of reading, listening, and writing skills. Just like in reading comprehension, there's also very strong distractors. For one of these multiple choice questions, some of the words that appear in the wrong option appear on the tape script, but these are for the wrong answer. The correct answer is actually paraphrased using different words. And this is something which is very, very tricky for some students, and something that seems to have come from the comprehension papers. The next question type requires candidates to identify pictures. Based on Dr. Carter's descriptions, candidates have to look at 6 pictures of different creatures and identify 3 creatures found in a trench in the order they are mentioned. Candidates should pay attention to the descriptions of these creatures' distinctive body parts, such as 2 sets of fins, 8 long, very thin legs, and several short legs on the other side of the bodies. They should notice the differences in the pictures and look at those differences. Again, look out for distractors and especially negatives. For example, it's called a spiderfish. In fact, it isn't like a spider. The isn't can make it very confusing if they miss the very subtle nt at the end of the is, the negative. So look out for negatives in these type of picture descriptions. There's another multiple choice selection question in task 2. In this question, candidates have to select the 2 conditions that are difficult to maintain when bringing snailfish to the sea surface. Again, for this one, I would like to use prediction. I like to sort of try and guess the answers before they appear. And this helps me to focus much more on the options. And I think it's very, very useful for the students as well. There are lots of distractors here. And again, lots of negatives, which students have to listen very, very carefully for, so as not to get distracted. The key words are the conditions that are hard to maintain. So some of these, all of these conditions may be hard to maintain, may be ones they need to maintain, but only 1 or 2 of them are hard to maintain. And again, you can sort of predict 1 or 2 of them. I believe things like deep water pressure is one of the options. And water pressure, I think, is common sense. When you bring something up to the surface, water pressure is going to be a problem. So do try and use your prediction skills. Okay, now task 3 is about the expedition 2 centuries ago. This is the one that I said was very, very similar to what appeared in an old exam paper years and years ago. Tells you something about how old I am. A question answering format is integrated into the note sheet in task 3. In 2018, task 2 in part A was divided into 3 subparts, and the last part was in the question answering format. But in between the subtasks, there was a 5-second pause. Instructions to candidates were played at the beginning of each subpart, so it's almost like separate little tasks. But this year, it's one continuous dialogue. There are no pauses at all. Very, very similar to the old AS level papers, in fact. So it's therefore important for candidates to fully utilize the preparation time to study the whole task carefully. They have very little time to study these questions once the actual tape starts playing. Luckily, there are some things that can help them. There are very strong indicating words that the speaker is about to move on to a new section. For example, they might say, now let's move on to the next part of this, or now let's move on to the next chapter, or okay, we've finished talking about this part, let's move on. These key words are very crucial to students who get lost, who can then move on to the next section, even if they got lost in an earlier part. Oh, and I just want to also mention that prediction I used a lot because I knew this passage quite well when I was listening to it. Unfortunately, the exam authorities changed quite a few of the details from the original passage. So some of my predicted responses were wrong, but that was good because it made me focus much, much more on the new information when it came along. Okay, now let's look at task 4. By far the most difficult of the 4 tasks. And again, it's very similar to many of the older AS level papers rather than the old HKCEE papers. Candidates are required to listen for main ideas and specific information, as well as inferring and summarizing details to be able to answer the questions accurately. This year, candidates have to listen to an extract from an audiobook and a scholar criticizing the author and the book content. The audiobook extract is basically a lengthy speech by one person, so it could be difficult to focus and be alert. It does go on for quite a while. The keywords and phrases in this task are not particularly challenging, but the conversation runs very smoothly, and so the students really need to prepare and read everything before the listening starts. Some of the answers are not repeated or paraphrased, so this means that speed of writing down the answers is also really important. Students may need to use some abbreviations and later write the full forms when they have time to correct and make changes. I certainly did. Now let's look at the level of difficulty. And as I've just mentioned, task 4 was way more difficult than any of the other tasks. And task 1 was almost certainly the easiest. I found it very, very easy. Just writing simple words down and lots of key information to just copy out. We can see then there's a clear progression in terms of difficulty from task 1 to task 4. This progression is not only reflected in the density of information, but also in the complexity of the answers required, with task 4 really needing some paraphrasing, changing of words, synthesizing of information. This means that candidates should allocate more of the initial preparation time to familiarize themselves with what to do and what information to expect later in tasks of Part A. Candidates should, however, bear in mind that for all types of Part A tasks, they are advised to study the given words and the questions carefully and try to predict what they will hear in the recording. For task 4 especially, I think reading through the questions is good. If you get lost, you know, something is coming up, you can refocus on the new parts. Also, clear handwriting was really important when you're writing quickly. So overall, similar to past years, there's an overwhelming amount of information in some parts of the tasks in Part A. Speed in transcribing is essential, especially in the later tasks. So we encourage students to strengthen their shorthand skills to be able to jot down information in a very short time, then summarize, organize, and please tidy up your answers later. It's also important for candidates to be able to read instructions in each part carefully and follow them correctly. This is actually part of the exam. Reading instructions is just as important as listening. Failing to do so will lose marks, even if you require the correct information. For example, circling answers, forgetting to select free boxes, not using block capitals if you're told to do so, writing full sentences. These are all parts of the exam instructions. Any failure to follow them can lead to loss of marks. Candidates should utilize the preparation time and predict what they will hear in the recordings. I keep on repeating this, but I really do think prediction is a very useful exam skill. They also need to fully understand what answers they're required to give and avoid distractors, especially with multiple choice questions. Pay attention to the phrases that appear printed in the paper, as well as what they listen, as well as what students listen to, and this will hopefully help to avoid quite a few mistakes. It's also essential for candidates to think on their feet, to constantly revise the information. Like I said, the changing of the US dollars to Hong Kong dollars means revising one of the answers you've written down. Guessing what's going to come next. If you get lost, if you've read the instructions and all the note headings, you know how to move on to another section. All these are essential skills to do well in this exam, especially in the Part 4, where if you do get lost, which is very common, you can actually just get a few marks and build up. In the earlier sections, by following the instructions, you can really get very high marks, and this can counter any weaknesses in section 4 as well. So hope that was a little bit helpful. We're going to now look at Part B, and let's take a look first at the overall picture across the situations in the past papers, including this year's. Here you can see the theme or topic, the situation, and the identity assigned to the candidate. Throughout all the papers from 2012 to 2018, Part B has involved a workplace situation where the candidate is assigned the identity of an employee or assistant. In 2019, however, the situation is school-based, and the candidate's assigned identity is a student. This year, the workplace situation has returned. Candidates have to imagine they are an assistant to the director of Starpod, an organization that promotes space exploration and organizes adventure camps for children. The assistant has to help the director with some tasks related to events run by the organization. If we look again at part A, by way of comparison, we can see that the two parts of paper 3 are thematically linked. In 2018, both part A and B carry a theme of surrounding games. Similarly, the themes of both parts in this year's paper are related. Part A focuses on different types of exploration, such as eco-expeditions, ocean exploration, while part B centers around space exploration. However, candidates should bear in mind that the link in the themes of the two parts in paper 3 is not always very closely related, and they should prepare themselves for all kinds of situations that may be presented. Now, here we have a breakdown of the tasks within part B. On the left, you can see that the part B1 starts off with an instruction video script, almost like a speech, followed by an email responding to a parent's complaints and an FAQ for parents. Unlike previous exams, the first task in part B1 this year is not a task requiring only short answers. That type of task actually moved to task 7. It's an FAQ containing 14 questions. The word count for the FAQ task is not given, but candidates are reminded to make their answers in complete sentences in order to present information in a clear way. So some attention to basic grammar and sentence structure is very important. Going back to tasks 5 and 6, the stipulated word counts for them are 100 words and 150 words respectively. The total word count for both tasks is thus 250 words, which is exactly the same as that for tasks 6 and 7 in last year's exam paper, and actually slightly less than that for 2018. Part B2 starts off with an introductory video script, followed by an incident report and an email reply refusing a request. The total count for part B2 is much longer, around 500 words, which is the same as last year's. The email reply is the longest task in this paper, and this is indicated by the number of pages given for this task. 3 blank pages are given. Correspondence, for example, emails and letters, have always been popular in the previous exams, and this year there is 1 email in each of part B1 and part B2. Reports have become another popular recurring type of text that candidates should be familiar with. Compared with previous exams, there is a less diverse range of text types this year. For part B1 or part B2, both students had to complete a video script and an email, regardless of whether they're doing B1 or B2. However, an awareness of different text types is obviously essential. We don't know what's going to come up each year, so students should be used to doing all types of texts. And we should remember that the text type also greatly influences the language candidates use in their writing. Furthermore, there's a clear requirement here for students to be very aware of the context in which they are writing, the target reader, and subsequently the register or tone. Let's talk about each task now in more detail. Now, task 5 is an instruction video script. Candidates have to write the script for an instruction video to brief participants about an activity at the adventure camp. The video will be shown to the participants before the activity begins. But since the participants are children, the tone of the script needs to be lively, clear, and very straightforward. I think that can be quite challenging. Task 6 is perhaps the most difficult. It's an email responding to a parent's complaints about her daughter's experience at the camp. The parent's concerns should be addressed one by one with a sincere and polite tone. This can be quite difficult for weaker learners. So it's very important for students to be polite, to show that the complaints are groundless without actually upsetting the reader and saying things like, "You are wrong." But actually say, "Unfortunately, you made mistakes. Unfortunately, we have to point out that," and then explain the real situation. Task 7 is a list of 14 frequently asked questions about Starpod's adventure camps. Candidates should make their answers in complete sentences, and the sentences have to be clear and easy for parents to follow. Task 8 on part B2 is an introductory video script briefing participants about an activity at the adventure camp. The video will replace some PowerPoint slides used to introduce the activity. Candidates are required to make changes to one of the PowerPoint slides based on some feedback given by last year's activity instructors and the senior instructor and course organizers' comments. Similar to task 5 in part B1, the tone of the script should be lively, clear, and interesting, since the participants are children. Task 9 is an incident reporting what happened on a multi-axis trainer. Candidates are required to explain what happened to a camp participant based on a doctor's conclusions and an engineer's assessment of the machine. It needs recommendations, and the recommendations should be made at the end of the report to suggest how similar incidents should be prevented. These recommendations must be very logical, and if students have had practice in writing reports which need recommendations, this should be very helpful to them. Last but not least, task 10 is an email replying to a charity. Candidates are required to refuse the charity's request to borrow a machine and give appropriate reasons while showing sensitivity. And I should stress that this is very key, showing sensitivity. You have to try not to annoy the reader and explain to them the very valid reasons why you're refusing the request. And you're also giving a counter proposal. And in that counter proposal, you should be made to show that StarPod is willing to support the charity and to help it as much as they can to make them feel much, much better about their own request not being accepted. It's quite difficult to write this well, so students have to be very, very skillful. We'll now move on to the recording of the data file. For part B, candidates have to listen to a podcast in which the director of StarPod speaks to a professor and an astronaut. They need to take notes on the listening note-taking sheet as they listen. Note-taking skills are very important here, so using the headings to predict what information is coming. For the data file this year, items included are the following, 10 items in total. A lengthy instructional email for both part B1 and B2. These are crucial for telling you what you have to do. One short letter of complaint in B1, an abstract of an article, a lengthy minutes, email exchange, a poster design, a short email, a web page, and a calendar. Part B2, as well as the instructional email, there's again lengthy minutes, a PowerPoint slide, a medical exam form, a lengthy feedback compilation and some comments, one lengthy letter of request, which needs to be followed very carefully, one assessment report with a sketch, and one web page and one feasibility report. Much more challenging. Looking at this year's and previous year's recurring data file formats, a few remain the most frequently featured. Lengthy emails about how to accomplish certain tasks. These are obviously crucial, and students have to follow these very, very carefully to collect all the relevant information. Web pages from which candidates have to extract specific information, and meeting minutes, which have become more and more popular in recent years. It should be noted that the meeting minutes in both part B1 and part B2 this year contain some distractors that may seem like useful information at first glance. The minutes in part B2 contain further instructions and where to look for information in a particular task. In other words, they revise your initial information about what you have to do. And this is very, very crucial in selecting the correct and updated information in the data file. There are other data file item formats this year, such as a calendar, medical exam form, and including a transcript of a doctor-patient conversation, letters, technical reports, feedbacks, and comments. And also, something that's also become very, very common in recent years is interpreting statistical or pictorial information in Part B. This year, there is a drawing in Part B2. It's not just for decoration, it is useful, and students should pay attention to any sketches, diagrams, find out if they're useful or not, because interpreting those graphic informations can be essential. We can, in summary, say that part B1 and part B2 present similar challenges. Paper 3 has always emphasized on integrating information from several sources of different types, especially in part B2, and this year is no different. There are distractors in some of the data file items and revisions on what was originally required. Candidates have to be quick, patient, and very careful to scan through and revise the information that is required as necessary to extract accurate and appropriate content points for certain tasks. Candidates are required to extract information from written records of conversations and be able to correlate pieces of information and present them in their own words to complete the tasks. In other words, they need to synthesize that information. They should also understand the purpose of different tasks and who the target readers are in order to write in appropriate styles and tones. Candidates have to understand and interpret data from non-textual sources, such as sketches, and we believe that in future, these challenges will still be present in Paper 3, Part B. And because of this, students must acquire a wide range of reading and writing skills to integrate information and present them logically in writing. They should also do lots of practice. Practice papers are very, very helpful. Okay, now I'd like to move on to the speaking section very, very briefly. And of course, we all know that this section was cancelled this year. We are going to look at some of the recent trends and patterns that are coming up in this, though. We'll look at the 2019 paper briefly. And we can see that the topics that came up were mainly social issues. The vast majority was social issues. We also had leisure, health, education, technology, world culture, study and work, and sports. As usual, the tasks were divided into Part A, group discussion, and Part B, individual responses. And in both sections, pronunciation, communication strategies, vocabulary and language patterns, and ideas and organization were all given marks. The number of versions of the question papers published is 24, although the exam authority report says there are actually about 30 different sets of question papers that are used. You can see the summary of the topics here. Like I mentioned earlier, social issues is by far the most common. Topics often are related to the student's own life, and this makes it much easier for them to talk about it. Topics such as cheating at school and screen time control should very well be problems that candidates have discussed in school or with their family, and this gives them a lot more to discuss. Very often, even world topics are transferred into local issues. For example, a seemingly international topic about the age of the US president, which came up last year, actually is then transferred into a discussion topic dealing with more local ideas. In fact, developing youth in Hong Kong into leaders. Lots and lots of local topics. 2019 had McSleepers, promoting Hong Kong drinks, etc., etc. Topics with a more global point of view are much more difficult for many of the students. Those students who have a world view of things tend to do much better on these. Some students are actually fascinated by world culture, and they can actually apply their knowledge to the discussion and get lots of very interesting points, and I believe extra marks by their world knowledge. So I think world knowledge, I like world knowledge questions because students can actually show off their knowledge, and you can really differentiate brighter students with more varied ideas. Also, very important is coming up with original ideas. But perhaps the biggest hurdle is just using good communicative strategies, being polite to others and having constructive discussions rather than destructive discussions. In other words, I don't like people all arguing about whose point is right. I prefer someone building on another person's idea. To me, that is perfect. Someone gives an idea, the next student builds on that and adds to it before going on to their own idea. Let's now look at the context. In terms of the content of the discussion topic, we found that virtually all versions of the paper indicate a school context. This makes it a lot easier for the students. Usually the group is being instructed by someone, for example, a teacher, to carry out the discussion. And the most important pointer that candidates must follow under any of these discussion contexts is, like I said earlier, collaboration as a group. That doesn't mean you always let other people do the talking. You have to find strategies to do your own talking. I always love people who jump in, sort of not really jump in, but take over when someone's finished an idea and add to it. To me, that is perfect. And then hand it over to someone else. The input text types in 2019 are nearly all newspaper articles. And this is really, really common. 90% of them are newspaper articles. There are other types of text, but most of them are articles. And this has been an emerging pattern. And we've also seen the text getting simpler and easier to follow. And this is a big advantage to weaker students. To me, the texts are very useful in that they sort of familiarize the students a little bit with the topic. And more importantly, they often give weaker students a little bit of vocabulary that they can actually use in their discussions. Now, let's take a look at the individual responses. It's very important that and apparent that the majority of questions aim to push the candidates to draw on personal experience or observations. Very often, if students haven't had the personal experience, I think they sometimes have to think of friends who have and maybe use their experience as a way to respond. There's been a recurring pattern that we've seen in the past few years of the exam. Candidates should take advantage of topics they are familiar with, such as pressing the door close button in Hong Kong lifts, which is a wonderful habit here in Hong Kong, hearing strange or unusual English names around them, or taking selfies. Use what they know about this and use their own knowledge when they respond. It's worth noting that most questions do have simple sentence structures. And the main thing is that students should avoid giving a very quick response. Go slow. Don't go what I call motor mouth and speak very, very quickly. Because if you go very, very quickly, 1 minute is an awful long time to talk. And also, don't give too many points. Just give 1, 2, or 3 points and expand those points using if, because, for example, so that. And that is a very good way to expand to 1 minute in a very, very pleasant way. So in preparation for the exam, students should not only gain exposure to a wide variety of topics, but sharpen their ability to express personal experiences or stance. And that's all for paper 4. Let me pass the stage back to Yancy.
Thank you so much, Glenn, and thank you for your patience. We're overrunning a little bit. I will just spend the next couple of minutes giving you some of our newest edition of teaching and learning material. So on the screen here, you see our publications for senior secondary English, including our skills books, book 4 and book 5 for all 4 papers, and also our mock test series, all-in-one practice, volumes 1 to 3. This year, we have some new teaching and learning materials that we'd like to share with you. So first off is our self-study companion that we have for all-in-one practice, volumes 1 and 2. It is available online. The reason why we designed this self-study companion is it's basically a guide for students to use the mock test for their own independent learning. We want to help them develop their language and exam skills. We also have a specific focus in strengthening their use of high-frequency vocabulary. And also we want to provide additional support for exam practice. So let's take a quick look. For paper 1, we have pre-reading exercises that have a theme focus and also focusing on helping students build a better foundation for skills. We also have extra questions that either come in as remedial questions or challenging questions. in addition to the mock tests. We also have something called Scan to Listen. We have recordings of the reading passages. You can see on the screen here, there are QR codes that students can easily just scan with their own phones and listen to the reading passages being read out. We also have glossary that is also recorded, and students can see the examples and also the definitions, and also the Chinese translations as well, and parts of speech. For paper 2, we have extensive writing support, including helping students understand the text type, structural requirements, content points, and give them extra prompt questions in the self-study companion. And for paper 3, we have e-dictionary, notes and tips for parts B1 and B2. We have the graded versions in it with annotations. And we also have glossary. And again, students can scan to listen. For paper 4, we also have the e-dictionary, and we also have prompts and content points to help students excel in different themes and topics that will come up in the exams. Another addition we have are our answer checking PDFs now cover for the mock tests in our book 4 and book 5 skills books for all 4 papers. And you can see here we have the PDFs that are very easy to help you check answers with students and refer back and forth from the question part and the answers part. For paper 3 recording, we actually have included new fast and slow speeds. You can easily find that on our website. On the right to the screen that you see here is where you can find the fast speed and slow speed recordings for paper 3. For our volumes 1 to 3 in the all-in-one practice series, we have added model essays for our supplementary mock test, so you can find all new essays that are model answers for our mock tests. And as for our skills books, books 4 and 5, papers 1 and 2, we have added enhanced sample essays that are longer and written in a more sophisticated manner to help model for students a higher level of writing for their paper 2 exam. I mentioned earlier we have e-dictionaries for papers 3 and 4. So this is what it looks like. It helps students identify, understand, learn how to use high-frequency vocabulary in all of the papers. We also have a specific vocabulary list that is listed out by task in for our paper 3 practice exams and also mock tests. We have something called the exam skills building pack that helps students build their 4 skills for the exams. It can be accessed on our Aristotle eNote, which is an app. A lot of teachers are very concerned about term papers, so we'd like to just very briefly tell you that for our junior secondary material publications, Connect and Link, you can find all of our test papers here on this website. I'd like to tell you what we have in here. We have general English test papers for forms 1 to 3, writing test papers, speaking test papers as well. There are mid-year test papers, end-of-year test papers, and you will see on the websites there are test papers 1 to 3. This year, we currently have 6 new sets available. As for our listening test papers, you can find all 18 sets of listening test papers with recordings on our website as well. For our senior secondary material, we have a lot of term papers. They can all be accessed on our website. And we have 3 new ones that we have just published, terms paper 19 to 21. But you can also find each of our term papers that have been published in the past on our website as well. Last but not least, we have a lot of our resources online, and we know that it can be quite difficult to navigate through sometimes online. So we also have an offline version in the form of a resources thumb drive. So you can find all of our resources on it as well. So that's it for today, Aristo English Exam Analysis. Thank you for being here with us today, this morning. Feel free to leave us a message if you have any questions about anything. We will get back to you. And again, the exam information that we have presented today can be downloaded via the links that we have sent. Please feel free to contact us for more details on our new teaching and learning resources. Thank you again. Have a good day.